Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about environmental issues in general and plastic pollution in particular. My guest is an expert who just attended an international conference in Nairobi, Kenya. Mr. Felix Dodds is an adjunct professor in environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, and he's an associate fellow of the Telus Institute in Boston and the City of Bonn's International Ambassador. He co-authored a recent book, Tomorrow's People and How Technology Changing How We Live in Our Lives. Felix Dodds, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me again. Let's jump right into it. You do so many exciting things. We could just pick one topic and go on for 25 minutes, but let's talk about your recent conference, a United Nations conference, United Nations Energy Assembly, I believe, in Nairobi, Kenya. What was the purpose of that trip? And tell us about the conference.
Yeah, so it's actually the United Nations Environment Assembly. It was established at the Rio Plus 20 conference to upgrade the UN Environment Programme, its governing body, from 60 member states to a universal membership. So it has 193 states, just like the General Assembly. And it meets every 2 years to address critical issues in front of the environment. And we know that plastics is a critical issue. We see it on our television. We experience it in nature. When we're at the beaches, we see the waste there and the damage it does to the marine environment, but also, it's in our waste dumps and is polluting our soil and our biodiversity. So about 5 years ago, the UN Environment Assembly started a process to, in a sense, look at the issue in much more depth. It looked at what voluntary initiatives there were and whether or not those were having an impact. It then looked at whether there were additional voluntary approaches that it should take. And about September last year, they held a ministerial meeting and decided that it wasn't going to work just doing voluntary initiatives, that we needed to move towards a legally binding convention, just like climate change and just like the Ozone Convention. And by doing that, it set in motion a process by which this meeting I attended last week negotiated the setting up of what they call an intergovernmental negotiating committee, which will take probably 2 years to negotiate what they call a framework convention, which creates the narrative of what they want to address and how to deal with technology transfer, capacity building, financing, those kinds of things. And then what will happen is that they will ask member states to ratify that convention. That will probably take another 2 years. And then they'll start to really look at how they can move production away from using single-use plastics into using others. And it gives time for industry to realign. So that was one of the successes of the meeting. There were a number of other successes, particularly, and you're well aware of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have the Intergovernmental Panel that deals with biodiversity, but we don't have an intergovernmental panel that deals with chemicals and waste. And so this was established as well. So two really important outcomes from the conference. And then for the last 2 days of the conference, we looked at UNEP at 50, because it is in June, the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, which was the first environment conference that was held under the UN, and UNEP was created out of that conference. And so there was a looking back and a looking forward, and the looking back kind of recognized the role that Maurice Strong had played in the sense of being the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference and the Rio Conference, but also the first executive director of UNEP. And without the work that Maurice did, we wouldn't have had those 9 chapters of Agenda 21 that gave rights and responsibilities to 9 important stakeholders like business, local government, women's groups, indigenous peoples, etc. And so, the conference looked back. It looked back at the role of Mustafa Tolba, who was the second executive director who was there for nearly 20 years and really kind of laid the bedrock to the multilateral environmental agreements that we have today. You know, he was so critical in getting the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting chemicals, but he also was really building on the work that the Stockholm Conference did in identifying climate change as a problem by hosting, or with the World Meteorological Organization, 2 World Climate Conferences, which set the foundation for the establishment of the UNFCCC and the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, you know, UNEP has a very good history of developing multilateral environmental agreements and then trying to create a base to enable them to be based on strong science. And in UNEP's portfolio is the Global Environmental Outlook Report, which in a sense, one of the flagship reports of the UN.
Well, you're absolutely right. And people like Morris Strong and, well, the whole United Nations system, especially the UN Environment Program and some of the other parts of the UN, have been absolutely instrumental in focusing attention on these environmental problems. And you mentioned the Stockholm Conference and the Rio 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, which is absolutely pivotal to this whole discussion. And of course, various leaders of the UN, such as Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General, and of course, Guterres today, the Secretary General Guterres, have been instrumental in moving this forward. We won't spend all of our time on plastics, but plastics touch all of our lives. They're important to us. We have to have them. The key is, how can we use them so that they don't pollute and kill the fish in the sea and kill humans too? We've come to find out now that we have plastic pollution that we're involved with. There's so many dramatic examples. And when you were talking, I was thinking of 2. One where I guess they call them gyres, GYRES, I believe, these floating islands of plastic that come where the currents meet. You have the convective currents, and you have about, I guess, 4 around the world, and they're just miles and miles of plastic. And the second issue that we've heard a lot about is that some of the environmentalists are saying that by 2050, the plastics will outweigh the fish that are in the oceans. Did you folks focus on that, or did they use those to dramatically point out how dire the situation is?
They did. They used those kinds of examples to indicate what the problem is. But I mean, it's also in the landfills where we're putting plastics, which will, you know, be there for eons. And so the initial approach had come from looking at the sea, because that had been such a visual, and you've described that very well. But as they developed the conversation, it became clear that they had to address plastics as a whole, not just where it ends up. And so it's the first convention process, I think, that has looked at the circular economy as a key element of it. So, you know, I think you'll see a number of legislations as we move forward in this decade where the producer will have responsibility for the product that they put into the environment, and how that's done will differ depending on the particular type of product. That also, to be honest, expands, though it's not relevant to the plastics, but it expands into solar and batteries. You know, the last thing we want is to see solar panels at the end of their life ending up in dumps. We need to think of a way of making sure that those elements that are in those solar panels and the batteries are recycled. And so a move towards a circular economy has been also one of the very interesting developments in the last 5 or 6 years.
This is what we have to think about with every product we use. How can we use it safely? How, after the life of the product or the replacement of the product, can we recycle it, and to make sure that we don't create a bigger problem than the one we just dealt with for the past decades or centuries, or whatever the case might be. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a broad look at the environmental issues and also focusing a bit on the plastic pollution. My guest is an expert on these topics. Mr. Felix Dodds is an adjunct professor of environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina. He recently co-authored a book, Tomorrow's People and New Technology, Changing How We Live Our Lives. Felix, let's shift over to your book. I don't want to leave it out. It's very, very important. I know you don't want to leave it out either, I'll bet. So tell us about the book. Why did you decide to write it? And give us some of the main thoughts in the book.
Yeah, so I decided to write it because the President Biden, it wasn't just because of President Biden saying this, because he said it afterwards, but President Biden said we'll see 50 years of development in the next 10 years. The rapid change that we're going to see, because so many new technologies are emerging at the same time, is very difficult for people to understand. We've got robot dogs now patrolling the American-Mexico border. So these changes that we see around us, whether it's artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, all of these things seem kind of, how do they fit into our life? And so most of the books that have been written about the future, and our book looks to 2030. It looks to 2030 because of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the timeline for these 17 important goals, but also because of the kind of interim targets on climate change. And so most of the books that are around kind of look at things from the technology perspective. And what we tried to do in the book was to make it much more human and to look at how these technologies might look in our home life. What would our house look like? How different would travel be like? What would entertainment of the future look like? How would work change? What would education look like? In a sense, how would we bring in artificial intelligence or augmented reality or virtual reality into education? How would our health service change? We're looking at things like the Sophia robot that is now already available to try and help older people or people with disabilities in their homes to make their life a better life, where they can communicate if they're alone with at least the robot, but also to look at how different this would be around the globe. And some countries are still experiencing the first industrial revolution, or the second, or the third, or all of them at the same time. So it was to try and make it seem much more real. And we put some cartoons in there, which kind of were more humorous, but we hope that the book also makes people think about these changes and how they want those changes to come in, and whether there needs to be some forms of governance changes to address that. And the Secretary General made his announcement last September for our common agenda. And in that, he talks about having a futures conference. And I think we need to have national dialogues about how these technologies are going to come in. Are they going to be good? We can see in the Ukraine the use of drones in the context of warfare. All of these things are happening around us, but we're not having a dialogue about it. And we were hoping that the book might stimulate that dialogue.
It's absolutely critical that we do that. And of course, many of the ideas that you've discussed, many of these, inventions that are with us or will be with us are certainly going to be energy efficient. They're going to help us cut down on pollution. They're going to be assisting people to manage their time better and that type of thing. The one question I have is the way the climate is deteriorating so quickly. And we just saw the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out, but again, with dire warnings, even more dire than the previous 5 that came out before this one. And so my question is, how much time do we have before we see that the glaciers are just going to be uncontrollably melting to where they will never come back unless we have an ice age or something like that, which would be probably as bad as the heating of the planet. But how much time do we have?
I mean, it's a difficult thing because we have seen a massive change in the amount of development in addressing climate change. So if you imagine you were before the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, then the World Bank was talking of a global temperature rise of 3 to 4 degrees by the end of the century. If you take the targets that were agreed to, or at least the national contributions, determined contributions that countries put forward in the Glasgow summit, and the additional targets through the coalitions of the Willing, the Methane Coalition, or the Deforestation Coalition, then according to the carbon tracker, you're looking at a temperature rise of something like 1.8 to 2.3. We're getting close to a potential 1.5. Now, of course, those commitments do not mean they will happen, as we have seen with previous government commitments on climate change. But it's up to us to, double up the work that Greta and others have done on the streets to keep the pressure on the politicians. And one of the decisions in Glasgow was that they would review the national determined contributions, not in 5 years, but in 1 year in Sharm el-Sheikh. So I think we're on the right track. The question is, are we going to get there quick enough?
That is exactly the question. It certainly is. And we have to move at a much faster pace. It seems to me, just reading, again, as just an amateur reading the newspapers and that type of thing. But one stumbling block is the financial interests that the fossil fuel industry has. And it's been reported that a few years ago, they had like 17, 18 trillion dollars in fuel underground, in gas, oil, coal, those types of things. And they're bent on pushing them, and they're pushing them and pushing them. And they say, well, we're becoming greener, we're going to be more energy efficient. A lot of that's just smoke, to be quite honest. Now, maybe some of them are serious, but most of them are not. They're out for the almighty dollar or ruble or rupee or whatever the case might be. So the situation has now gotten to the point, how do we talk to people? And a lot of the private sector believe that we've got to do something. They're moving quickly. But how do we convince everybody that if you lose coal miner jobs in West Virginia or East Kentucky, that they will benefit from this and there will be better jobs in the future, and that the society will be more productive, it'll be more sustainable, and it'll be more economically proficient?
Well, if I was the governor of West Virginia, which I'm not, then I would be bidding for teleworkers. I'd be saying, you don't have to live in New York anymore and do your work. You can work in a beautiful state like West Virginia, which has beautiful landscapes and beautiful rivers, and you can have a quality of life with your family that you wouldn't have been able to have. One of the advantages one of the repercussions of the COVID crisis is that we recognize we don't have to all be in the cities. We can repopulate some of the countryside. And I would say that West Virginia is a classic place where you could really put investments in to have people move there and have a quality of life. There's always going to be problems when you have change. And that's why the Sustainable Development Goals talks about the just transition. You need to help people to be able to move to different types of jobs. And Biden, though he didn't get his bill through, hopefully he will get some of the bills, the Build Back Better bill through as we move forward. The elements of it is to try and create that little cushion of maybe 10 or 15 years where the kinds of jobs that we would need to rebuild our infrastructure are not that far away from the coal miners' jobs or the jobs on the oil rigs and things like that, so that there are jobs for people like that. The young people of today are so different in their understanding of the world than the people of our generation, and they will pick up that change very quickly and drive it. And so I'm much more optimistic about that. But just on the industry thing, I think the most significant outcome of Glasgow was the setting up of the Glasgow Finance Initiative. And that has a huge number of banks, insurance companies, and investors. And if the investors are, they're talking about trillions of dollars here, if they're going to move the trillions of dollars away from supporting coal or oil and gas and towards solar and wind, then those companies will, over time, shrink and become irrelevant. And there are no more Blockbuster Video shops in the world, because Blockbuster Video did not survive when they had the opportunity to purchase Netflix. They made a decision that people thought that people would still want to have DVDs or tapes. And of course, that turned out not to be the case.
And with the situation that we've had with the elimination of jobs and the arrival of new jobs, it's even more important that we keep talking about this and we get the correct information out. And of course, we have so many forms of misinformation, disinformation. We've got major TV operations that put out so much misinformation. You know, we could talk about Fox, we could talk about One American News, we could talk about Newsmax, whatever, but it's so critical to get information that's correct to the public so that we can have a logical debate about what's going on. How do you see the flow of information in this country?
Well, so it was under President Reagan that you took away the requirement for balanced news. And I think, though you wouldn't get it through Congress at the moment, at some point you have to reintroduce the requirement for every TV company to have to produce balanced news. That would stop Fox from producing that. In the UK, we have that. In Europe, we have it. So you don't get the kind of ridiculous situations that we've had here. It may be that the court cases will start to move Fox and One American News towards being much more factual. But jobs will change in the future. I mean, the types of jobs that we have now will be different. You'll see things like virtual store Sherpas, augmented reality journey builders, memory augmented surgeons, vertical farmers. Some of the big shopping centers will not have the shops that we are used to because people are buying online. I could see those being converted into vertical farms, which will be a really interesting space. We're already seeing many of the recent North Carolina, seeing some of the shopping centers being converted into more lifestyle places where you go to do your gaming or you go to do your exercise. So I think there's a lot of interesting developments that will happen. But as the book was meant to try and say, look, there are governance issues, and you're discussing a governance issue. You're talking about the lack of balanced news, the way that, in a sense, the companies like Facebook and Twitter, they need legislation so that they are not that they don't have to police it themselves, but you know that if people are misbehaving there, that they're dealt with very quickly.
It's absolutely critical that we have a dialogue on this, and nobody is trying to suppress anybody's communication freedom and that type of thing. No First Amendment issues there, but we have to start putting out reliable information and not some of this ridiculous, nonsensical stuff and the conspiracy theories. We didn't even get into those. I mean, they're just unimaginable, the QAnon nonsense and what have you. But the hardest question yet, Felix, in the last 30 seconds, what do you see as our major problem as we move forward in dealing with these issues?
I think one of the big challenges is going to be a generational one, that our generation sees things in a particular way and the younger generation sees things in a different way. And that challenge of generations, I think, will be really difficult as this new technology starts to really ramp up and come in.
It is very important, and you're absolutely right. And our viewers can go to a variety of websites to get more information. Of course, you were talking about the United Nations Environmental Assembly. They can go to unep.org to get information, or they can go to un.org for more information, or you could just Google it and find some reliable sources that will present objective information on what we're talking about and what the problems are and why we have to focus on them and work together to develop strategies and not break up into warring camps and just try to have political fights with each other. That's not going to solve the problem. But Felix Dodds, you've just done so many remarkable things, and we'll have to have you back again to talk about some of the others. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.